On the morning of March 16, 1968, elements of Task Force Barker moved into a small group of hamlets known collectively as My Lai in the Quang Ngai province of South Vietnam. It was intended to be a typical search-and-destroy mission. That is, the American troops were searching for Viet Cong soldiers so as to destroy them. Relative to other units operating in Vietnam, the troops of Task Force Barker had been somewhat hastily trained and thrown together. In the previous month, they had achieved no military success. Unable to engage the enemy, they had themselves sustained a number of casualties from mines and booby traps. The province was considered to be a Viet Cong stronghold, one in which the civilians aided and abetted the guerrillas to such a degree that it was often difficult to distinguish the combatants from the non-combatants. Army intelligence had indicated that Viet Cong were being harbored by the villagers of My Lai. The task force expected to find combatants there. On the eve of the operation, there seemed to be a mood of anticipation. The nature of the instructions given to the enlisted men and junior officers that evening by the senior officers was at best ambiguous in regard to the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Although essentially all elements of Task Force Barker were involved one way or another in the operation, the primary element of ground troops directly involved was C Company. When Charlie Company moved into the hamlets of My Lai, they discovered not a single combatant. None. None of the Vietnamese was armed. No one fired on them. They found only unarmed women, children, and old men. Some of the things that then happened are unclear. What is clear, however, is that the troops of C Company killed at least somewhere between 500 and 600 of those unarmed villagers. The most large-scale killings occurred in the particular hamlet of My Lai 4. There, the 1st Platoon of Charlie Company, under the command of Lieutenant William L. Calley, Jr., herded villagers into groups of 20 to 40 or more, who were then slaughtered by rifle fire, machine gun fire, or grenades. It is important to remember, however, that substantial numbers of unarmed civilians also were murdered in the other hamlets of My Lai that day by the troops of other platoons under the command of other officers. The killing took a long time. It went on throughout the morning. The number of soldiers involved can only be estimated. Perhaps only about 50 actually pulled triggers. Approximately 200 directly witnessed the killings. We might suppose that within the week, at least 500 men in Task Force Barker knew that war crimes had been committed. The failure to report a crime is itself a crime. In the year that followed, no one in Task Force Barker attempted to report the atrocities that had occurred at My Lai. The fact that the American public learned about My Lai at all was due solely to a letter that Ron Ridenour wrote at the end of March 1969 to several congressmen about the atrocities, more than a year after they had occurred. Ridenour had not himself been a part of Task Force Barker, but had later heard of the atrocities in idle conversation from friends who had been at My Lai, and he wrote his letter 3 months after his return to civilian life. In the spring of 1972, I was chairman of a committee of 3 psychiatrists appointed by the Army Surgeon General at the request of the Chief of Staff of the Army to make recommendations for research that might shed light on the psychological causes of My Lai, so as to help prevent such atrocities in the future. The research we proposed was rejected by the General Staff of the Army, reportedly on the grounds that it could not be kept secret and might prove embarrassing to the administration, and that, quote, further embarrassment was not desirable at the time, unquote. The rejection of the recommendations of the Committee for Research is symbolic of several issues. One is that any research into the nature of evil is likely to prove embarrassing, not only to those who are the designated subjects of the research, but also to the researchers themselves. If we are to study the nature of human evil, it is doubtful how clearly we will be able to separate them from us. It will most likely be our own natures we are examining. Undoubtedly, this potential for embarrassment is one of the reasons we have thus far failed to develop a psychology of evil. The rejection by the general staff of our recommendations for research also highlights the fact that in considering the evil at My Lai, as in all our other considerations of evil, we suffer from a simple lack of scientific knowledge. Therefore, much of what follows is only speculative. Triggers are pulled by individuals. Orders are given and executed by individuals. In the last analysis, every single human act is ultimately the result of an individual choice. Not one of the individuals who participated in the atrocities in My Lai, or in their cover-up, is blameless. In Books 1 and 2, our focus has been on specific individuals whom I have labeled evil and distinguished from the vast majority of other individuals I have designated not evil. Even if we allow that this sharp distinction is somewhat arbitrary, that there is a whole continuum between those who are thoroughly evil and those who are not at all evil, we are left facing a problem. How is it that approximately 500 men, the majority of whom were undoubtedly not evil as individuals, could all have participated in an act as monstrously evil as that at My Lai? Clearly, to understand My Lai, our focus must not be limited solely to individual evil and individual choice. We are now, therefore, concentrating on the phenomenon of group evil as being somewhat distinct from, although in many respects similar to, the phenomenon of individual evil. For many years it has seemed to me that human groups tend to behave in much the same ways as human individuals, except at a level that is more primitive and immature than one might expect. Why this is so, why the behavior of groups is strikingly immature, why they are from a psychological standpoint less than the sum of their parts, is a question for which there is more than one right answer. One of those is the problem of specialization. Whenever the roles of individuals within a group become specialized, it becomes both possible and easy for the individual to pass the moral buck to some other part of the group. In this way, not only does the individual forsake his conscience, but the conscience of the group as a whole can become so fragmented and diluted as to be non-existent. Bearing in mind the psychological immaturity of groups, we shall be examining aspects of both the My Lai crimes, the atrocities themselves, and their cover-up. Although the cover-up may seem less atrocious than the atrocities, they are all part of the same ball of wax. How is it that so many individuals could have participated in such a monstrous evil without any of them being so conscience-stricken as to be compelled to confess? The cover-up was a gigantic group lie. Lying is simultaneously one of the symptoms and one of the causes of evil. It is why this book is entitled People of the Lie. Certainly by virtue of their extraordinary communal participation in the cover-up, the men of Task Force Barker were a people of the lie. By the time we are finished, we may even conclude that the American people, at least during those war years, were also a people of the lie. As with any lie, the primary motive of the cover-up was fear. The individuals who had committed the crimes, who had pulled the triggers or given the orders, obviously had reason to fear reporting what they had done. Court-martial awaited them. But I suspect there is another extremely significant reason that the crimes of My Lai went unreported for so long. I offer it purely as conjecture that to a considerable extent the members of Task Force Barker did not confess their crimes simply because they were not aware that they had committed them. They knew, of course, what they had done, but I suspect that many of them did not even consider it a crime. They did not confess because they did not realize they had anything to confess. How can this be? How can a sane man commit murder and not know he has murdered? How is it that a person who is not basically evil may participate in monstrous evil without the awareness of what he has done? It is this question that will serve as a focal point for the discussion that follows on the relationship between individual and group evil. I believe that anyone who has been in significant chronic pain or prolonged discomfort will recognize that we humans naturally, almost inevitably, tend to regress. Our psychological growth reverses itself. Our maturity is forsaken. Quite rapidly we become more childish, more primitive. Discomfort is stress. The fact of the matter is that the troops of Task Force Barker were in a chronically stressful situation. They were at the other end of the world from their homes. The food was poor, the insects thick, the heat enervating, the sleeping quarters uncomfortable. Then there was the danger, more stressful because it was so unpredictable. Besides regression, there is another mechanism whereby human beings respond to stress. It is a mechanism of defense. Robert J. Lifton, who studied the survivors of Hiroshima and other disasters, has called it psychic numbing. In a situation in which our emotional feelings are overwhelmingly painful or unpleasant, we have the capacity to anesthetize ourselves. The sight of a single bloody, mangled body horrifies us. But if we see such bodies all around us every day, day after day, the horrible becomes normal, and we lose our sense of horror. We no longer truly see the blood, or smell the stench, or feel its agony. Unconsciously, we have become anesthetized. When it no longer bothers us to see mangled bodies, it will no longer bother us to mangle them ourselves. It is difficult indeed to selectively close our eyes to a certain type of brutality without closing them to all brutality. How can we render ourselves insensitive to brutality except by becoming brutes? I think we can assume, therefore, that after a month in the field with Task Force Barker, a month of poor food, of poor sleep, of seeing comrades killed or maimed, the average soldier was more psychologically immature, primitive, and brutish than he might otherwise have been in a time and place of less stress. In Book 1, I spoke of the relationship between narcissism and evil, and said that narcissism is a condition out of which human beings normally mature. We may think of evil, then, as a kind of immaturity. Immature humans are more prone to evil than mature ones. And since we normally regress in the face of stress, can we not say that human beings are more likely to be evil in times of stress than in times of comfort? As we shall see, this is but one of many factors that accounted for the evil at My Lai. Individuals not only routinely regress in times of stress, they also regress in group settings. One aspect of this regression is the phenomenon of dependency on the leader. It is quite remarkable. Most people would rather be followers. More than anything else, it is probably a matter of laziness. It is simply easy to follow, and much easier to be a follower than a leader. There is no need to agonize over complex decisions. plan ahead, exercise initiative, risk unpopularity, or exert much courage. The problem is that the individual adult becomes psychologically dependent on the leader, as a child is dependent on its parents. In this way, there is a profound tendency for the average individual to emotionally regress as soon as he becomes a group member. In the military, the dependency of the soldier on his leader is not simply encouraged, it is mandated. By nature of its mission, the military designedly and probably realistically fosters the naturally occurring regressive dependency of individuals within its groups. I have already made note of the fact that patterns of group behavior are remarkably similar to the behavior of an individual. This is because a group is an organism. It tends to function as a single entity. A group of individuals behave as a unit because of what is called group cohesiveness. There are profound forces at work within a group to keep its individual members together and in line. Probably the most powerful of these group cohesive forces is narcissism. In its simplest and most benign form, this is manifested in group pride. As the members feel proud of their group, so the group feels proud of itself. Once again, the military deliberately does more than most organizations to foster pride within its groups. It is no accident that the common term for group pride is a military one, esprit de corps. A less benign but practically universal form of group narcissism is what might be called enemy creation, or hatred of the outgroup. Task Force Barker, of course, had a pre-designated enemy, the Viet Cong. But almost inevitably, the specified enemy was generalized to include all Vietnamese. It is common knowledge that the best way to cement group cohesiveness is to ferment the group's hatred of an external enemy. Deficiencies within the group can be easily and painlessly overlooked by focusing attention on the deficiencies or sins of the outgroup. But this use of narcissism is potentially evil. In Books 1 and 2, we have extensively examined the ways in which evil individuals will flee self-examination and guilt by blaming and attempting to destroy whatever or whoever highlights their deficiencies. Now we see that the same malignant narcissistic behavior comes naturally to groups. From this, it should be obvious that the failing group is the one likely to behave most evilly. Failure wounds our pride, and it is the wounded animal who is vicious. Group leaders in all places and ages have therefore routinely bolstered group cohesiveness in times of failure by whipping the group's hatred for the enemy. We will remember that at the time of My Lai, the operation of Task Force Barker had been a failure. After more than a month in the field, the enemy had still not been engaged. Yet the Americans had slowly and regularly sustained casualties. The enemy body count, however, was 0. Failing in its mission, which was to kill in the first place, the group leadership was all the more hungry for blood. Given the circumstances, the hunger had become indiscriminate, and the troops would mindlessly satisfy it. I have already mentioned the potential for evil in specialized groups. An important fact to bear in mind about specialization is that it is seldom either accidental or random. It is usually highly selective. Task Force Barker was a specialized group existing solely for the purpose of conducting search and destroy missions in Quang Ngai Province. What the listener may not realize, however, is the large amount of selection and self-selection involved in the creation of that group. Task Force Barker consisted either of career military personnel who had deliberately chosen the combat arms, or young grunts who had done likewise. The case of a prototypical individual may serve to illustrate some aspects of the relationship between American society in 1968, its military, and the subgroup of the military fighting in Vietnam. Let us call this prototypical individual Larry, and set the place of his origin as Iowa. The oldest of 6 children, born to an alcoholic farmhand and his tired wife, Larry was clearly a hellraiser from the time he hit puberty. Dropping out of high school as soon as he turned 16, in 1965, Larry vaguely supported himself with a series of odd jobs that proved inadequate to pay for his car insurance, gas, and heavy drinking lifestyle. In November 1966, he was apprehended attempting to rob a local gas station. The community had no desire to increase the state prison population or its tax burden, so the county judge told Larry he had 2 choices: to join the Army or go to jail. Larry enlisted for Vietnam because he had heard that the girls were easy there, and besides, shooting up some gooks might be kind of fun. I do not mean to imply that Task Force Barker was made up of petty criminals like Larry, but it was not any random group of men. It was highly specialized, not only in its mission, but also in its unique composition. The specialized human composition of Task Force Barker, and countless other human groups, raises 3 significant issues. First is the question of the flexibility that can be expected of specialized human beings. Charlie Company was a specialized group of killers. The individuals in it had, for one reason or another, gravitated toward the killing role, as well as being deliberately seduced into that role by the system. In addition, we trained them for the role and provided them with the weapons to perform it. Is it surprising, then, given a host of other contributory circumstances, that they killed indiscriminately, or that they apparently failed to experience great guilt over what we had led them to do? Is it realistic to encourage and manipulate human beings into specialized groups and simultaneously expect them, without any significant training, to maintain a breadth of vision much beyond their specialty? A second issue is the subtle but definite scapegoating involved. The prototypical Larry was a scapegoat. When his community pushed him into the Army, it was not attempting to deal with the human social problem he presented. It was simply getting rid of the problem. The people purified their own community by dumping the dirt on the military, sacrificing Larry to the god of war. And they scapegoated the military as well. It is, of course, one of the unwritten functions of the military to serve as a dumping group for some of the more misbegotten of America's youth, a sort of national reform school. But the fact that this system works rather smoothly, and not always for ill, should not blind us to the scapegoating nature of the process. By then seducing him into Vietnam, the Army, of course, further scapegoated Larry. On the one hand, it makes a definite kind of social logic. Why shouldn't those individuals like Larry, who are troublemakers and misfits, be the most appropriate candidates for cannon fodder? If someone has to be killed, why not let it be one of apparent little social value? But the decision to kill was not Larry's, nor Lieutenant Cowley's, nor his superior officer, Captain Medina's, nor Lieutenant Colonel Barker's. It was America's decision. For whatever reason, America decided that there would be killing, and insofar as these men killed, they were all doing America's bidding. They may have seemed dirtier and less noble than the average American, but the fact is that we Americans, as a society, deliberately chose and employed them to do our killing, our dirty work, for us. In this sense, they were all our scapegoats. And this is the third issue we must look at. It is not only possible but easy and even natural for a large group to commit evil without emotional involvement, simply by turning loose its specialists. It happened in Vietnam. It happened in Nazi Germany. I am afraid it will happen again. What we need to learn is that whenever we create specialty groups, we are creating the dangerous possibility that our right hand will not know what our left is doing. Our society developed and currently maintains the policy of an all-volunteer military. Abandoning the concept of the citizen soldier in favor of the mercenary, we have placed ourselves in grave jeopardy. The military will inevitably become not only specialized in its function, but increasingly specialized in its psychology. A draft, involuntary service, is the only thing that can keep our military sane. I have spoken of the relationship between a specialized small group, such as Task Force Barker, and the larger group that spawns it. Now let us turn to the large group itself. In this instance, the United States military. My purpose here is not to present a fully balanced picture of the military, but to examine one of the military's failures as an example of the phenomenon of group evil. Consequently, it is necessary to focus on the less savory aspects of the military mind, or soul. In a time of sustained peace, the military man is disregarded, at best considered by his country as a necessary evil, and more often as a rather pathetic parasite on the body politic. In a time of war, however, he suddenly becomes needed again, filling a role not only regarded as useful, but absolutely essential by his society. The drudge becomes the hero. It is inevitable, then, that the ordinary career military man, unconsciously if not consciously, desires, longs for war. War is his fulfillment. And in 1968, it was the military man that had to bear the full brunt of the exquisite pain of America's humiliation in Vietnam. It was the unvanquished military that was failing in the performance of its very raison d'etre. The pride of the military was badly wounded. Again and again, we have noted the birth of evil from a condition of threatened narcissism. For the military, the conditions were ripe for evil. Just as the highly narcissistic, evil individual will strike out to destroy whoever challenges his or her self-image of perfection, so by late 1967, the American military organization, highly narcissistic, as all groups tend to be, began to strike out with uncharacteristic viciousness and deceit against the Vietnamese people, who were wreaking such havoc on its self-esteem. Although the atrocity at My Lai was undoubtedly unique in magnitude, I have every reason to suspect that smaller atrocities were being committed by American troops throughout Vietnam at the time. I think we can safely say that My Lai occurred in the context of an atmosphere of atrociousness and evil that was pervasive not only in Task Force Barker, but throughout the entirety of the American presence in Vietnam. While the military may have been crashing around in Vietnam like a crazed bull, it did not get there of its own accord. The mindless beast was sent there and let loose by the United States government acting on behalf of the American people. Our military involvement in Vietnam began in the period between 1954 and 1956, when the idea of a monolithic communist menace seemed realistic. A dozen years later, it was no longer realistic. Yet at precisely the time when it had ceased to be realistic, when we should have been readjusting our strategy and withdrawing from Vietnam, we began to seriously escalate our military involvement there in defense of obsolescent attitudes. Why? Why, beginning around 1964, did America's behavior in Vietnam become increasingly unrealistic and inappropriate? There are two reasons: laziness and, once again, narcissism. I think we may properly regard the men who governed America at the time of My Lai, the Johnson administration as lazy and self-satisfied. They, like most ordinary individuals, had little taste for intellectual confusion, nor for the effort involved in maintaining a, quote, posture of constant self-doubt and criticism, unquote. They assumed that the attitudes they had developed toward the monolithic communist menace during the preceding 2 decades were still the right attitudes. Although the evidence was obviously mounting to throw their attitudes into question, they ignored it. To do otherwise would have placed them in the painful and difficult position of having to rethink their attitudes. They did not take up the work required. It was easier to proceed blindly, as if nothing had changed. Thus far, we have been focusing on the laziness involved in clinging to attitudes that have become obsolete. Let us also examine the narcissism. We are our attitudes. If someone criticizes an attitude of mine, I feel he or she is criticizing me. If one of my opinions is proved wrong, then I have been proved wrong. My self-image of perfection has been shattered. Individuals and nations cling to obsolete and outworn ideas, not simply because it requires work to change them, but also because in their narcissism they cannot imagine that their ideas and views could be wrong. When this happens, the nation, instead of readjusting in the light of the evidence, sets about attempting to destroy the evidence. This was what America was up to in the 1960s. The situation in Vietnam presented us with evidence of the fallibility of our worldview and the limits of our potency. So, rather than rethinking it, we set about to destroy the situation in Vietnam, and all of Vietnam with it, if necessary, which was evil. Evil has already been defined most simply as the use of political power to destroy others for the purpose of defending or preserving the integrity of one's sick self. Since it had become outmoded, our monolithic view of communism was part of our national sick self, no longer adaptive and realistic. The issue ceased to be what was right for Vietnam and became an issue of our infallibility and preserving our national honor. Strangely enough, on a certain level, President Johnson and the men of his administration must have known what they were doing was evil. Otherwise, why all the lying? But it would be a mistake and a potentially evil rationalization itself for us to blame the evil of those days entirely on the Johnson administration. We must ask why Johnson was successful in defrauding us. Why were most of us not aroused to ire or suspicion or even significant concern about the nature of the war? Once again, we are confronted with our all-too-human laziness and narcissism. Basically, it was just too much trouble. We all had our lives to lead, doing our day-to-day jobs, buying new cars, painting our houses, sending our kids to college. As the majority of members of any group are content to let the leadership be exercised by the few, so as a citizenry we were content to let the government do its thing. By allowing ourselves to be easily and blatantly defrauded, we as a whole people participated in the evil of the Johnson administration. The evil, the years of lying and manipulation of the Johnson administration was directly conducive to the whole atmosphere of lying and manipulation and evil that pervaded our presence in Vietnam during those years. It was in this atmosphere that My Lai occurred in March 1968. Task Force Barker was hardly even aware that it had run amok that day. But then America was not significantly aware either, in early 1968, that it too had almost unredeemably lost its bearings. Group evil is not just something that happened one morning in 1968 on the other side of the world. It is still happening all over the globe. It is happening here today. Like individual evil, group evil is common. In fact, it is more common. So common, indeed, it may be the norm. I began this discussion by noting how responsibility becomes diffused within groups, so much so that in larger groups it may become non-existent. Consider the large corporation. Even the president or chairman of the board will say, "My actions may not seem entirely ethical, but after all, they're not really a matter of my prerogative. I must be responsive to the stockholders, you know. On their account, I cannot help but be directed by the profit motive." Who is it then that determines the corporation's behavior? The small investor who does not even begin to understand the operations involved? The mutual fund on the other side of the nation? Which mutual fund? Which brokerage house? Which banker? We are living in the age of the institution. So, as they become larger and larger, our institutions become absolutely faceless, soulless. What happens when there is no soul? Is there just a vacuum? Or is there Satan where once, long ago, a soul resided? I do not know, but I think that the anti-war activists, the Berrigan brothers, are correct when they say that the task before us is nothing less than to metaphorically exorcise our institutions. There is no word adequate to describe the urgency of this task. The military-industrial complex that played such a large role in Vietnam and continues to be a primary creator of the grotesqueness of the arms race is submitted to nothing but the profit motive. This is not submission at all. It is pure self-interest. I am not an enemy of capitalism per se. I believe it is possible for the profit motive to be operative and at the same time submitted to higher values of truth and love. Difficult, but possible. If we cannot somehow engineer this submission and, quote, Christianize, unquote, our capitalism, we are doomed as a capitalist society. The total failure of submission is always evil, for a group, for an institution, for a society, as for an individual. Unless we can heal ourselves by submission, the forces of death will win the day, and we will consume ourselves in our own evil. Our study of My Lai revealed the operation of gross intellectual laziness and pathological narcissism at every level. The task of preventing group evil, including war itself, is clearly the task of eradicating or at least significantly diminishing laziness and narcissism. The effort to prevent group evil, including war, is of course a process of education. This book was written in the hope that someday all children will be carefully taught that laziness and narcissism are at the very root of all human evil, and why this is so. They will come to know that the natural tendency of the individual in a group is to forfeit his or her ethical judgment to the leader, and that this tendency should be resisted. And they will finally see it as each individual's responsibility to continually examine himself or herself for laziness and narcissism, and then to purify themselves accordingly. They will do this in the knowledge that such personal purification is required not only for the salvation of their individual souls, but also for the salvation of the world. There are a variety of reasons we have not yet developed a psychology of evil. But perhaps the most important reason is the fear of the consequences. We have good reason to be afraid. There are real dangers inherent in the development of a psychology of evil. Anyone who seeks to participate in the endeavor of subjecting the phenomenon of evil to the scrutiny of science should begin by deeply considering that this endeavor in itself has potential for causing evil. Evil is a moral judgment. I am proposing that it may also be a scientific judgment. But making the judgment scientifically will not remove it from the moral sphere. The word is pejorative. Whether we call a man evil on the basis of pure opinion or on the basis of a standardized psychological test, we are passing a moral judgment. Shouldn't we refrain from doing either? Science is dangerous enough. Moral judgment is danger enough. How dare we mix the two in the light of Jesus' admonition, "Judge not that ye be not judged"? If we examine the matter more closely, however, we will see that it is both impossible and itself evil to totally refrain from making moral judgments. An attitude of "I'm okay, you're okay" may have a certain place in facilitating our social relationships, but only a place. Let us look at everyday life. What kind of father would I be if I discovered my son cheating, lying, or stealing, and failed to criticize him? What should I tell a friend who is planning suicide, or a patient who is selling heroin? You're okay? There is such a thing as an excess of sympathy, an excess of tolerance, an excess of permissiveness. The fact of the matter is that we cannot lead decent lives without making judgments in general and moral judgments in particular. We must also remember the purpose for which we judge. If it is to heal, fine. If it is to enhance our own self-esteem, our pride, then the purpose is wrong. There but for the grace of God go I is a reflection that should accompany every judgment of another's evil. While we may never ultimately discern the meaning of human existence, including just why this person is good and the other evil, it still remains our responsibility to live as best we can, which also means to go on making the moral judgments necessary to support life. The issue, then, is not whether to judge. We must. The question is how and when to judge wisely. Our great spiritual leaders have given us the basics. But since in the end we must make moral judgments, it makes sense to further refine our wisdom with the application of scientific method and knowledge of evil when appropriate, as long as we remember the basics. Many experiences have taught me that what is paraded as scientific fact is simply the current belief of some scientists. We are accustomed to regard science as truth with a capital T. What scientific knowledge is, in fact, is the best available approximation of truth in the judgment of the majority of scientists who work in the particular specialty involved. Truth is not something that we possess. It is a goal toward which we, hopefully, strive. What is worrisome about this is the possibility that scientists, specifically psychologists, will make public pronouncements on the evil of certain personages or events. We scientists, unfortunately, are no more immune than anyone else to jumping to unsound conclusions. The problem is aggravated by the fact that the public is actually eager to be guided by the pronouncements of the scientists. As we earlier discussed in relation to the issue of group evil, the majority would rather follow than lead. In our intellectual laziness, we forget that scientific thought is almost as faddish as taste. Since the current opinion of the scientific establishment is only the latest and never the last word, we must, for our safety as a public, bear the responsibility of being skeptical of our scientists and their pronouncements. The dangers inherent in developing a scientific psychology of evil are very real. They should not be underestimated. But in the world of the conglomerate and the neutron bomb, of the Holocaust and My Lai, the way seems clear. The dangers of developing a psychology of evil do not approach in magnitude the danger of failing to subject human evil to strenuous and coordinated scientific scrutiny. Dangerous though a psychology of evil might be, it will be more dangerous not to have one. Evil is ugly. We are all in combat against evil. But if we attempt to deal with evil by destroying it, we will also end up destroying ourselves, spiritually if not physically. If we kill those who are evil, we will become evil ourselves. We will be killers. What to do then? We must begin by giving up the simple notion that we can effectively conquer evil by destroying it. But this leaves us in a sort of nihilistic vacuum. Are we to throw up our hands, to regard the problem of evil as being inherently insoluble? Hardly. That would be meaningless. It is in the struggle between good and evil that life has its meaning, and in the hope that goodness can succeed. That hope is our answer. Goodness can succeed. Evil can be defeated by goodness. When we translate this, we realize what we have dimly always known. Evil can be conquered only by love. So the methodology of our assault on evil, scientific and otherwise, must be love. If we are to safely conduct research on evil people, we must do so in love. We must start from an a priori position of love for them. The path of love is a dynamic balance of opposites, a painful, creative tension of uncertainties, a difficult tightrope between extreme but easier courses of action. Consider the raising of a child. To reject all its misbehavior is unloving. To tolerate all its misbehavior is unloving. We must somehow be both tolerant and intolerant, accepting and demanding, strict and flexible, and almost godlike compassion is required. The healing of evil, scientifically or otherwise, can be accomplished only by the love of individuals. A willing sacrifice is required. The individual healer must allow his or her own soul to become the battleground. He or she must sacrificially absorb the evil. Then what prevents the destruction of that soul? If one takes the evil itself into one's heart, how can one's goodness survive? Even if the evil is vanquished thereby, will not the good be also? What will have been achieved beyond some meaningless trade-off? I cannot answer this in language other than mystical. I can only say that there is a mysterious alchemy whereby the victim becomes the victor. I do not know how this occurs, but I know that it does. I know that good people can deliberately allow themselves to be pierced by the evil of others, to be broken thereby, and yet somehow not broken, to even be killed in some sense, yet still survive and not succumb. Whenever this happens, there is a slight shift in the balance of power in the world.
People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil by M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled. Book 2, The Encounter with Evil in Everyday Life. Dr. Peck.
Psychiatrists brush against evil not once or twice in a lifetime, but almost routinely as we come in contact with human crises. And it is my contention that the name of evil should have a definite place in our lexicon. It is true that there are very real dangers to such naming, but without the name, we will never clearly know what we are doing in such cases. We will remain limited in our capacity to help the victims of evil, and we will have no hope whatsoever of dealing with the evil ones themselves. For how can we heal that which we do not even dare study? Since I met the men and women and families I am describing in my practice of psychiatry, I am concerned that the listener will think, "Ah, yes, but these are special cases. These people may be evil, but he is not talking about my kind of people, my colleagues, my acquaintances, my friends or relatives." This is not so. Like it or not, the psychiatrist sees as much psychopathology at cocktail parties, conferences, and corporations as in her or his own office. While the data I am presenting are drawn from my psychiatric practice, most of the time I shall be speaking not so much about psychiatric patients as about human beings anywhere and everywhere. In Book 1, we considered a person, the case of George, who was not evil but was in grave danger of becoming so. Then, to illustrate some of the principles involved in people who had crossed the line and descended into evil, a couple was described, the case of Bobby and his parents. In Book 2, I shall describe others who are frankly evil. The most typical victim of evil is a child. This is to be expected because children are not only the weakest and most vulnerable members of our society, but also because parents wield a power over the lives of their children that is essentially absolute. This power, like all power, is subject to abuse of various degrees of malignancy. A rather intriguing feature of the case of Bobby was the extraordinary unity of his parents. They functioned as a team. We cannot say that Bobby's father was evil, but his mother was not, or that his mother was evil and his father was just along for the ride. As far as I could tell, they were both evil. The victims of evil encountered in everyday psychiatric practice are not, however, always children. Let us turn now to the case of Hartley and Sarah, a childless couple in their late 40s. I shall describe a single interview that I had with the two of them together. It will give us a clue to the further understanding of the phenomenon of evil people. The case of Hartley and Sarah. I first saw them a week after Hartley had been discharged from the state hospital. A month before, at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, Hartley had cut both sides of his neck with a straight-edge razor. Bare-chested, he walked into the living room and announced to Sarah, "I just tried to kill myself again." Sarah turned around to see the blood streaming down his torso. She called the police, who called the ambulance. Hartley was taken to the local emergency room. The cuts were relatively superficial. He had failed to sever either the carotid arteries or the jugular veins. After the cuts were sutured, he was transferred to the state hospital. It was his third suicide attempt and third admission to the state hospital during the preceding 5 years. Because they had recently moved into the area, Hartley was referred for follow-up care to our clinic after he was discharged from the hospital. His discharge diagnosis was involutional depressive reaction. He was on high doses of antidepressant and tranquilizing medication. When I went out to the waiting room to greet him, Hartley was sitting silently next to his wife, staring into space with dull eyes. An average-sized gray man who seemed smaller, as if he had been crushed into a very little space. He looked as depressed as the Black Hole of Calcutta. "I'm Dr. Peck," I said to him. "Come on into my office." "Can my wife come too?" Hartley mumbled in a pleading tone. I looked at Sarah, a thin, angular woman, smaller than her husband, yet seeming considerably larger. "If it's all right with you, Doctor," she responded, smiling sweetly. Her smile was incongruous with the faintly bitter expression conveyed by the tight wrinkles around her mouth. Once we were all seated, I looked at Hartley. "Why did you want your wife to come in with you?" I asked. "I'm more comfortable when she's close to me," he replied flatly. I must have looked quizzical. "Hartley's been that way for the longest time, Doctor," Sarah announced, smiling gaily. "He hates to let me out of his sight for a moment." "Why is that?" I asked Hartley. "I'm scared." "Scared of what?" I inquired. "I don't know. I'm just scared." "I think it's because of his thoughts, Doctor," Sarah interrupted. "Go on, Hartley. You can tell him about your thoughts." Hartley said nothing. "What thoughts is she talking about?" I asked. My thoughts about kill, Hartley replied in his monotone. Kill? I repeated. You mean you have thoughts about killing? No, just kill. I'm afraid I don't understand, I said lamely. It's just a word thought, Hartley explained without emotion. The word kill comes into my mind, like someone had said it. Most of the time it's in the morning, when I get up and start shaving, and start looking at myself in the mirror. It's just there. Kill. Almost every morning. Do you shave with a straight-edge razor? I asked with sudden intuition. Hartley nodded. It sounds as if you want to kill someone with your razor, I continued. Hartley looked frightened. It was the first sign of emotion I had seen. No, he said emphatically. I don't want to kill anyone. It's not a feeling. Just a word. Well, you apparently wanted to kill yourself, I commented. Why was that? I feel so horrible. I'm no good to anyone. I'm nothing but a burden to Sarah. The heaviness of his voice weighed on me. Is he a burden to you? I asked Sarah. Oh, I don't mind, she replied cheerfully. I would like to be able to have a little time to myself. And of course we don't have enough money. So he is a burden, you feel? The Lord supports me, Sarah answered. Why is it you don't have enough money? I asked. Hartley hasn't worked for 8 years, the poor dear. But we get by on what I make at the telephone company. I used to be a salesman, Hartley interjected plaintively. He did manage to work the first 10 years we were married, Sarah agreed. But he was never really very aggressive, were you, dear? Hartley was silent. Why did you stop working? I asked him. My depression. I felt so awful in the mornings. What was making you so depressed? Hartley looked puzzled, as if unable to remember something. It must have been my words, he said finally. You mean the words in your mind like kill? He nodded. Are there other words as well? I asked. Hartley was silent. Go on, dear, Sarah said. Tell the doctor about the other words. Well, sometimes there are other words, he acknowledged reluctantly, like cut or hammer. Any others? Sometimes blood. Those are all angry words, I commented. I don't think they would come into your head unless you were very angry. I'm not angry, Hartley insisted dully. What do you think? I asked, turning to Sarah. Do you think he's angry? Oh, I think Hartley hates me, she answered with her gay little smile. I stared at her in amazement. I had begun to suspect the truth of this, but I hardly expected her to be so calmly aware of it. Aren't you worried that he might hurt you? Oh, no. Hartley wouldn't hurt a fly, would you, dear? Hartley did not respond. It seems to me that if I were you, Sarah, I'd be quite frightened, living with a husband who hates you and thinks of such things. But you don't understand, Doctor, Sarah explained placidly. He couldn't hurt me. He's such a weakling. I quickly glanced at Hartley. There was absolutely no expression on his face. How does it make you feel to hear your wife call you a weakling? She's right. I am weak, he mumbled. Hartley can't even drive a car, Sarah interjected. He can't go out of the house without me, can you, dear? Hartley nodded in dumb assent. You seem to agree with your wife about everything, I pointed out. She's right. I can't go anywhere without her. Why can't you? I don't know, he replied abjectly. I get scared when Sarah isn't around to help me. You sound like you're a very young child, I commented. Sarah smiled complacently. Hartley is a child in some ways, she said. You aren't very grown up, are you, dear? Maybe you don't want him to grow up, I said quickly, turning on her. Sarah flashed me a look of sudden hatred. What? She snapped. When have my wants ever been considered? My wants have never mattered to anyone. It isn't a question of what I want or don't want. I only do what I have to, what the Lord wants me to do. Who cares that Hartley's a burden? Who cares that I do all the work, that I do all the driving, that I do all the shopping? But I don't complain. No, what right do I have? No, Sarah doesn't have any rights. Hartley's just a worm of a man, but no one cares about Sarah. I just shoulder the burdens the Lord has given me. I was taken aback by this diatribe, but I proceeded more out of curiosity than a sense I could help the situation. I gather the two of you have no children, I said. Was that a choice you made? Hartley's incapable of producing children, Sarah announced. Oh? How do you know that? Sarah gave me a look suggesting I was ignorant of the facts of life. Because I've been examined by the gynecologist. He said there's nothing wrong with me. Have you also been examined? I asked Hartley. He shook his head. Why not? Why should I? There's nothing wrong with Sarah, so it must be my fault. Hartley, you're just about the most passive man I've ever met, I said. You passively assume your wife is telling the truth about her examination. You passively assume that because her examination was normal, yours would be abnormal. There are lots of cases in which both the husband and wife are normal but still don't have children. You may well be perfectly okay. Why don't you check it out? There would be no point to that, doctor, Sarah answered for him. We're too old to have children, and we don't have the money for any more tests. You forget that I'm the one who makes all the money. Besides, she said smiling, can you imagine Hartley being a father? He can't even make a living. But wouldn't it be worth it for Hartley just to know that he's not physically incapable of being a father? Sarah's right, Hartley said, actually coming to the defense of his wife's assumption of his inadequacy. There'd be no point to it. By now I was feeling there was no possibility of help for Hartley. He was too far gone. But how in the name of God did such misery come about, I wondered. Tell me about your childhood, I directed him. There's nothing to tell, Hartley mumbled. Well, how far did you go in school, I asked. Hartley went to Yale, Sarah answered for him again. But then you flunked out, didn't you, dear? Hartley nodded. How did you happen to go to Yale, I asked. My family was wealthy. But you also must have been quite bright, I commented. It's no good being bright if you don't work, Sarah interjected once more. Handsome is as handsome does, I always say. I turned to her. Are you aware that every single time I try to focus on whatever assets your husband might have, you jump in and castrate him? She screeched at me. Castrate him? Castrate him, do I? All you doctors are alike. Maybe you castrate him, they say. It's all my fault, isn't it? Oh, yes, it's always Sarah's fault. Well, let me tell you, he was castrated before I ever met him. His mother was an alcoholic slob. His father was as weak as he is. He couldn't even make it through college. And then they accused me of marrying him for his money. Ha! What money? His slut of a mother had spent all the money slopping up her booze. I haven't seen any money. Nobody's ever helped me out. Sarah does it all. But she castrates him, they accuse. But do you think any of them are ever interested in me? No, no one. They just accuse me. I could be interested in you, Sarah, I said gently, adding, if you'd let me. Why don't you tell me something about your family and your growing up? Oh, so now I'm the patient, am I? She asked bitterly. Well, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be your guinea pig. I don't need your help. There's nothing wrong with me. I can get all the help I need from my minister. He understands me. He knows what I go through. God gives me all the strength I require. I brought Hartley here for help. He's the one who needs it. You help him. That is, if you can. I'm quite serious, Sarah, I said. You're quite right that Hartley needs help, and we will give him whatever help we can. But I think you need help as well. It's a terribly difficult situation that you're in, and I can see you get upset by it. But Sarah had pulled herself together. She smiled at me as if I was a nice but misguided young man. Thank you, Doctor, you're very kind, she said, but I'm afraid I don't get upset. I beg to differ, I countered. I think you just were upset. Quite upset. Perhaps you're right, Doctor, Sarah replied. Hartley's illness has been a terrible burden on me. It would be much easier for me if he didn't exist. I winced inwardly. Hartley was so depressed and downtrodden that he was beyond being affected. "Why don't you leave him then?" I asked. "I think you would be better off without the burden. And in the long run, it might also be better for Hartley if he were forced to stand on his own 2 feet. "Oh, I'm afraid Hartley needs me too much for that, Doctor," Sarah responded, smiling maternally. She turned to her husband. "You wouldn't be able to make it if I left you, would you, dear?" Hartley looked terrified. "It would certainly be very difficult for him," I acknowledged. "But it could perhaps be arranged for Hartley to go into the hospital for an extended period of time." "Would you like to go back to the hospital, dear?" Sarah asked him. "And have me leave you?" "Please," Hartley whined. "Please don't. Tell the doctor why you don't want me to leave, will you, dear?" Sarah commanded. "I love you," Hartley whimpered. "See, Doctor," Sarah explained victoriously. "I couldn't leave him when he loves me." "But do you love him?" I asked. "Love?" Sarah asked, almost with amusement. "What is there to love?" "No, I think you might best call it duty, Doctor. I have a duty to take care of him." "I'm not sure how much it's duty and how much it's need," I said, confronting her. "From where I sit, it looks as if you have a deep-seated need for the burden that Hartley represents, just as he has an overpowering need to depend on you. Your needs are being fulfilled by this strange marriage just as much as his are." Sarah laughed oddly, a weird, hollow giggle. "Apples and oranges, Doctor," she said. "You can't compare them. You can't compare Hartley and me. We're like apples and oranges. But you don't know which is which, do you? Am I the apple or am I the orange? Am I crinkly-skinned or smooth-skinned? Or am I thick-skinned? We have to be thick-skinned against those who persecute us. You're the pseudoscience persecutors. But it's all right. I know how to handle the orange peelers and the apple slicers. The Lord loves me. We have power in heaven. You can think what you think, say what you say, but it's garbage," she spat. "That's where they end up, isn't it? The orange peels and the apple slices, in the garbage. And that's where all you pseudoscience persecutors will end up, in the garbage, with all the other fruits," she ended triumphantly. I became frightened that I had made a mistake in confronting Sarah as I listened to her lose her control. "I gather you don't feel yourself in need of any treatment at this time, Sarah, and certainly you seem to be functioning well. But Hartley definitely seems to require some assistance, don't you think?" "Yes, poor Hartley is not doing well," Sarah agreed, acting as if the past few minutes had never happened. "We should do whatever we can to help him." "Do you think you need to stay on your medicine?" I asked Hartley. He nodded mutely. "Your thoughts get worse when you don't take your pills, don't they, dear?" Sarah said. He nodded again. "How about psychotherapy, Hartley?" I asked. "Do you think you'd like to spend some time with someone talking about yourself in depth?" "No, it makes me feel bad," he mumbled. "His last suicide attempt before this one occurred when they tried to give him psychotherapy," Sarah confirmed. I wrote out Hartley's prescriptions and said I would like to see them again in 3 weeks to determine whether the medication needed adjusting. "But that appointment," I explained, "will be very brief." "Of course, Doctor," Sarah said as the 3 of us stood up. "You've already done so much for Hartley, we can't thank you enough." As Hartley and Sarah were going out the door, I overheard Sarah say, "This doctor's so much nicer than the one at the other clinic, don't you think? At least he's American. We couldn't even understand what that other one was saying, could we, dear?" Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this case is not Sarah's evil, but Hartley's relationship to it. Hartley was in thrall to Sarah. He had voluntarily sold his soul into Sarah's keeping. Why? At one point during the session, I had told Hartley that he was just about the most passive man I'd ever met. A passive person means an inactive person, a follower instead of a leader, a receiver instead of a doer. I could have used a number of other words: dependent, infantile, lazy. Hartley was monumentally lazy. His relationship with Sarah was that of an infant clinging to its mother. He would not even come into my office alone, much less take the risk or exert the energy to think independently for himself. Why Hartley was so extremely lazy, we do not know for certain. Sarah's comments that his mother was an alcoholic and his father as weak as he suggest that he came from a family in which his parents probably served as lazy role models, and he probably failed to receive adequate fulfillment of his infantile needs. We can postulate that by the time he met Sarah, he was already a profoundly lazy person, a child in adult's clothing who was unconsciously seeking the strong mother he never had to take care of him. Sarah filled the bill perfectly, just as he undoubtedly met her requirements for a potential slave. Once the relationship was established, it became a vicious circle, naturally intensifying the sickness of each. Her domination further encouraged his submissiveness, and his weakness further nourished her desire for power over someone. So Hartley was not simply an unwilling victim of Sarah's evil. This is important, because the case exemplifies a general rule. We do not become partners to evil by accident. As adults, we are not forced by fate to become trapped by an evil power. We set the trap ourselves. The case of Hartley and Sarah was introduced in part by the observation that it seemed impossible to tell which partner of an evil couple was the evil one. Both of Bobby's parents seemed evil, but by the very nature of their evil, I was unable to get close enough to them to know them well. My purely speculative suspicion is that they were not as equally evil as they seemed. I doubt it is possible for two utterly evil people to live together in close quarters of a sustained marriage. They would be too destructive for the necessary cooperation. I suspect, therefore, that one or the other of Bobby's parents was the more dominant in their mutual evil. In every evil couple, if we could examine them closely enough, I imagine we would find one partner at least slightly in thrall to the other, in the same manner as Hartley was in thrall to Sarah, albeit hardly to the same degree. If the listener feels Hartley and Sarah's relationship was a bizarre one, I agree. Bizarre though it was, the type of relationship it illustrates is quite common. The phenomenon of thralldom in marriage is not rare. I suspect that listeners will, on reflection, also be able to recognize this type of marriage among at least some of their acquaintances. In Book 1, I defined evil as the use of power to destroy the spiritual growth of others for the purpose of defending and preserving the integrity of our own sick selves. In short, it is scapegoating. We scapegoat not the strong, but the weak. For the evil to so misuse their power, they must have the power to use in the first place. They must have some kind of dominion over their victims. The most common relationship of dominion is that of parent over child. Children are weak, defenseless, and trapped in relation to their parents. They are born in thrall to their parents. It is no wonder, then, that the majority of the victims of evil, such as Bobby, are children. They are simply not free or powerful enough to escape. For adults to be the victims of evil, they too must be powerless to escape. They may be powerless when a gun is held to their head, or they may be powerless by virtue of their own failure of courage. Hartley was physically free to escape. Theoretically, he could have just walked away from Sarah, but he had bound himself to her by chains of laziness and dependency. And though titularly an adult, he had settled for the child's impotence. Whenever adults, not at gunpoint, become victims of evil, it is because they have, one way or another, made Hartley's bargain. To name something correctly gives us a certain amount of power over it. Through its name we identify it. We cannot even begin to deal with a disease until we identify it by its proper name. The treatment of an illness begins with its diagnosis. But is evil an illness? Many would not consider it so. There are a number of reasons why one might be reluctant to classify evil as a disease. Some are emotional. For instance, we are accustomed to feel pity and sympathy for those who are ill. But the emotions that the evil invoke in us are anger and disgust, if not actual hate. But the fact that we are not likely to feel a shred of sympathy for those who are evil speaks only of our own emotional response, and not the reality of whether evil is or is not an illness. Even when we still felt frightened and disgusted by lepers, we recognize leprosy to be a disease. Beyond our emotional reactions, there are 3 rational reasons that make us hesitate to regard evil as an illness. Although each of the 3 reasons is cogent in its own way, I shall nonetheless take the position that evil should indeed be regarded as a mental illness. I will do so in the context of examining the fallacy inherent in each of the 3 arguments. The first holds that people should not be considered ill unless they are suffering pain or disability, that there is no such thing as an illness without suffering. If overt suffering and self-definition are the criteria for illness, then the evil are the last ones to be considered mentally ill. Indeed, it is characteristic of the evil that in their narcissism, their self-absorption, they believe that there is nothing wrong with them, that they are psychologically perfect human specimens. But there are vast problems with this argument. There are a host of physical diseases that are wholly asymptomatic in their early stages. An executive discovered on a routine physical exam to have a blood pressure of 200/120 may be feeling perfectly fit. The Pap test has become a routine part of the regular medical care of women because it detects cancer of the cervix at a time when the cancer is curable, but years before it causes the woman any discomfort or disability. If we define diseases only in terms of the suffering they currently produce, then we must state that most cases of high blood pressure and cancer, among others, are not in fact diseases. This seems absurd. Of course, much of the time when physicians tell us that there is something seriously wrong with us, we take them at their word, whether we are in actual pain or not. Their definition that we are ill is acceptable to us, and therefore we begin to define ourselves as ill, even when we are not actually feeling ill. But not always. Consider the case of a farmer who suffers a serious heart attack that results in his losing consciousness and being brought to the hospital. The next day, when he is fully alert in the intensive care unit, he struggles to get out of bed and to rip the cardiac monitor off his chest. The nurses tell him to lie back and relax because he has had a heart attack, is seriously ill, and needs to be quiet lest he have another attack. "That's ridiculous," the farmer screams, struggling even harder. "There's nothing wrong with me. My heart's as sound as a dollar. I don't know how you tricked me here, but I've got to get home and milk my cows." When the doctor is called in, and several more attempts at reassurance fail, are we to let him get dressed and go home to work his farm? Or are we to restrain him as necessary, rapidly sedate him, and under these conditions continue to give him the true information and the time to come to terms with it? Obviously, we would follow the latter alternative, because we know that the man is seriously ill, despite the fact that he does not define himself that way, nor accept our definition. For we realize that his inability to define himself as ill in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary is actually a part of the illness itself. Is it not also this way for those who are evil? The failure of the evil to define themselves as disordered is an essential component of their condition. And disease, whether it be evil or delirium or psychosis or diabetes or hypertension, is an objective reality and is not to be defined by subjective acknowledgement or lack of acknowledgement. The use of the concept of emotional suffering to define disease is also faulty in several other respects. As I noted in The Road Less Traveled, it is often the unwillingness to suffer emotional pain that usually lies at the very root of emotional illness. Those who fully experience depression, doubt, confusion, and despair may be infinitely more healthy than those who are generally certain, complacent, and self-satisfied. The denial of suffering is, in fact, a better definition of illness than its acceptance. The evil deny the suffering of their guilt, the painful awareness of their sin, inadequacy, and imperfection, by casting their pain onto others through projection and scapegoating. They themselves may not suffer, but those around them do. They cause suffering. Finally, who is to say what the evil suffer? It is consistently true that the evil do not appear to suffer deeply. Because they cannot admit to weakness or imperfection in themselves, they must appear this way. They must appear to themselves to be continually on top of things, continually in command. Their narcissism demands it. Yet we know they are not truly on top of things. The appearance of competence is just that, an appearance, a pretense. Think of the psychic energy required for the continued maintenance of the pretense so characteristic of the evil. They perhaps direct at least as much energy into their devious rationalizations and destructive compensations as the healthiest do into loving behavior. Why? What possesses them, drives them? Basically, it is fear. They are terrified that the pretense will break down, and they will be exposed to the world and to themselves. They are continually frightened that they will come face to face with their own evil. Of all emotions, fear is the most painful. Regardless of how well they attempt to appear calm and collected in their daily dealings, the evil live their lives in fear. It is a terror and a suffering so chronic, so interwoven into the fabric of their being, that they may not even feel it as such. And if they could, their omnipresent narcissism will prohibit them from ever acknowledging it. Whether the evil suffer or not, the experience of suffering is so subjective, and the meaning of suffering so complex, I think it best not to define illness and disease in its terms. Instead, I believe that illness and disease should be defined as any defect in the structure of our bodies or our personalities that prevents us from fulfilling our potential as human beings. I said there were two other reasons one might hesitate to label evil an illness. They can be countered more briefly. One is the notion that someone who is ill must be a victim. We tend to think of illness as something that befalls us, a circumstance over which we have no control, an unfortunate accident visited upon us by meaningless fate, a curse in the creation of which we did not participate. Most recently, this issue has been debated in reference to alcoholism, some vigorously insisting that it is a disease, and others insisting that because it appears to be self-inflicted, it is not. Not only physicians but courts and legislatures have been involved in this debate and have reached the conclusion that alcoholism is indeed a disease, despite the fact that the alcoholic may sometimes seem nobody's victim except his or her own. The issue of evil is similar. An individual's evil can almost always be traced to some extent to his or her childhood circumstances, the sins of the parents, and the nature of their heredity. Yet evil is also always a choice one has made, indeed a whole series of choices. The fact that we are all responsible for the state of health of our souls does not mean that a poor state of health is something other than disease. Once again, I believe we are on safest and soundest ground when we do not define disease in terms of victimization or responsibility, but instead hold on to the definition already offered. An illness or disease is any defect in the structure of our bodies or personalities that prevents us from fulfilling our potential as human beings. The final argument against labeling evil an illness is the belief that evil is a seemingly untreatable condition. Why designate as a disease a condition for which there is neither known treatment nor cure? This argument ignores the fact that there are a whole host of disorders from multiple sclerosis to mental deficiency, for which there is no treatment or cure, but which we don't hesitate to call diseases. Perhaps we call them diseases because we hope to find the means to combat them. But is this not the case with evil? It is true that we do not currently possess any generally feasible or effective form of treatment to heal the thoroughly evil of their hatred and destructiveness. Indeed, the analysis of evil presented thus far reveals several reasons just why it is an extraordinarily difficult condition to approach, much less cure. But is a cure impossible? Are we to simply throw up our hands in the face of this difficulty and sigh, "It's beyond us," even when it is the greatest problem of mankind? Rather than being an effective argument against it, the fact that we currently do not know how to treat evil in the human individual is the best reason to designate it a disease. For the label of disease implies that the disorder is not inevitable, that healing should be possible, that it should be studied scientifically, and methods of treatment should be sought. If evil is an illness, it should then become an object for research, like any other mental illness, be it schizophrenia or neurasthenia. It is the central proposition of this book that the phenomenon of evil can and should be subjected to scientific scrutiny. We can and should move from our present state of ignorance and helplessness toward a true psychology of evil. Thus far, I have been speaking for the necessity for the accurate naming of evil from the standpoint of the evil themselves, that we might better appreciate the nature of their affliction, come to know how to contain it, and, I hope, eventually even cure it. But there is another vital reason to correctly name evil: the healing of its victims. If evil were easy to recognize, identify, and manage, there would be no need for this book. But the fact of the matter is that it is the most difficult of all things with which to cope. If we, as objectively detached, mature adults, have great difficulty coming to terms with evil, think of what it must be like for the child living in its midst. While the child can emotionally survive only by virtue of a massive fortification of its psyche, these defenses inevitably distort or compromise its life as an adult. It happens then that the children of evil parents enter adulthood with very significant psychiatric disturbances. We have been working with such victims, often very successfully, without ever having to employ the word evil. But it is doubtful that some can be wholly healed of their scars without correctly naming the source of their problems. To come to terms with evil in one's parentage is perhaps the most difficult and painful psychological task a human can be called on to face. Most fail, and so remain its victims. Those who fully succeed in developing the necessary searing vision are those who are able to name it. For to come to terms means to arrive at the name. As therapists, it is our duty to do what is in our power to assist evil's victims to arrive at the true name of their affliction. 2 case vignettes follow, in which it would have been impossible to render such assistance had the therapist not first recognized the face and spoken the name of evil. The first is the case of the voodoo dream.